I am Sherry, a Chinese girl of the 21st century who is greatly interested in European art history. Why, you might ask, am I interested? And how did I become interested? This documentary will tell you all about the fascinating story of art history and me. Since childhood, I've been visiting many European countries, and my parents always took me to the local museums and galleries wherever we went, such as the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, and the Uffizi Gallery in Italy, Florence. At first, I thought they were dull and there was nothing to look at. This all changed when I read a book about Greek mythology. I was fond of it, and when I found an artwork in a book that also appeared in the Louvre, I realized that many artworks were describing scenes of the mythological characters I was familiar with. So I started to enjoy these artworks. Every one of them was actually a scenario, a story with twists and turns. Instead of words on a page, though, these stories were depicted in lines and hues by the artists. As a viewer, I became the one that deciphered the paintings and figured out the tales hidden within them. This began my love for art history. Art history is about the history of art. However, I believe that art history is not just a timeline. From ancient Greece to contemporary art, art is evolving through time. Art history is mainly based on this evolution. Different artists are the spotlights in each art period, and they are shown as dots on a timeline. Nevertheless, the essence of art history is still understood through individual works of art. These artworks can show all the characteristics of a specific art period through portrayal of figures, scenarios, and stories. We can see the change of artists' brushstrokes, the hue they used, and the evolution throughout this whole timeline by comparing artworks from different periods. What makes the study of art fascinating is that there is an obvious shift in styles of art from different periods. From these shifts in style, we can understand the cultures and geographic areas that artists came from and the times they lived in. This documentary focuses on 4 European countries involved in art history: Greece, Italy, France, and Great Britain. Each of the countries has played a significant role in one or more periods of art history, from ancient times to modern centuries. The artworks from each country, frescoes, sculptures, oil paintings, and so on, exactly represent stages of art's evolution. Let's start from ancient Greece. I will introduce 3 periods: Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. The Archaic period, from around 650 to 480 BC, was the earliest phase in Greek art history. Art in the Archaic period signaled the start of depicting characters more realistically, but still following Stoicism, which is not showing one's genuine emotion, even if one suffers from extreme pain or misfortune. In this period, many potteries were produced with delicate paintings around the ceramics. The Neobit vase is a perfect example, and what makes it outstanding and different from other pottery was its depiction and arrangement of the painted characters in 3-dimensional space. This scene describes a story in Greek mythology about the mortal queen Niobe. She boasted that her children was better than Leto's, infuriating Apollo and Artemis and causing them to kill all her 14 children. The hunters are placed in a higher background level, emphasizing superiority. The mortal teens are lower and placed in the foreground. This use of background and foreground, or 3-dimensional perspective, is what makes the Neobit vase unique compared to other earlier vases. Another spotlight is the corals and core. Greek words meaning young male and young female statues. It can be readily acknowledged that corals can be nude, but core statues are always wearing garments. In the Archaic period, the coral sculptures represent human forms, but they are more simplified and less natural than later corals and statues. The Classical period, from 500 to 300 BC, was probably the most flourishing period in ancient Greek times. Noticeably, this period includes two major wars in ancient Greek history. The Persian War in 5th century BC, when the Greeks won against the Persians, and the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, when Athens was destroyed by the Spartans. In the Classical period, the techniques of sculpture made significant improvement in depicting figures accurately. Artworks of the Classical period reflected the confidence and stoicism of Athenian culture. Greeks began to consider aesthetics in their works by making them symmetric and adjusting their proportion. The most prominent production during this period is the Parthenon. This artistic and proportional architecture was once the temple of Athena, goddess of wisdom and patron of Athens in Greek mythology. The Parthenon assembles so many types of columns, patterns, and other architectural forms. Also, with its impressive reliefs on the outside, the Parthenon was an outstanding location high on the Acropolis from where you can have a good view of the city of Athens. With its tumultuous history of theft and bombing, it is the most remarkable achievement among all of ancient Greek architecture. The Parthenon has two massive triangular pediments with a group of sculptures in it, each describing a scenario of Athena. In the west pediment, it is a fight between Poseidon and Athena for the patron of Athens, and in the east pediment, there is the birth of Athena. Now in the British Museum, the remaining sculptures of east pediment are enough to demonstrate how realistic the works of the Classical period are. The muscles, the hair, and even the dress pleats were perfectly sculpted and realistic. In other parts of the Parthenon, where it was the triumphant Athenian battle scenes of the Menipes, or idealized everyday Athenians in the frieze, these sculptures represented the stoicism, confidence, and realism of the Classical period. The Hellenistic period is the last in Greek art history. Athenians didn't recover after losing the Peloponnesian War, and artists in this period couldn't withhold their feelings. They changed from stoic to expressive. They carved their characters with genuine emotions, fear, pain, heartbreak, becoming the highlights of every artwork. Famous sculptures include Nike of Samothrace, the winged Victory on the top of the grand staircase in the Louvre, and the Pergamon altar, describing the fight between the Olympian gods and the Titans. One of their common characteristics, besides emotion, is the movement of objects depicted. Take Nike as an example. The fabric of her dress is whipped backwards behind her body, and knowing that she is standing on a ship, it seems that the wind is blowing her clothing, making her realistic and vivid. Another well-known sculpture is Laocoon, which is about Laocoon the Trojan priest and his sons who were killed in horror by a snake sent by the gods. We can see the expressions of pain, fear, and anguish on their faces as they are devoured by the snake, and the perfect expression of the Hellenistic style. After ancient Greece, let's go talk about Italy, the three periods: early Renaissance, High Renaissance, and the Baroque. Before the Renaissance, most art existed in religious sites such as churches, and was made in the Byzantine style. The scenes painted by artists were generally the same ones from Christianity: Jesus' birth, an angel messenger and Virgin Mary, or Jesus' death. The Byzantine style was very flat. It seems like the characters depicted are made of thin papers, making them more symbolic and less realistic. Artists in this era would make certain important characters as giant as possible in the middle of an artwork, placing others on the side tiny and humble. Noticeably, artists use mosaic and golden leaf backgrounds in their artworks, making their scenes more divine. Classical style and Christian themes flourished during this Renaissance, which was between the 14th and 16th centuries. The building of Santa Maria del Fiore and its Duomo in Florence remarked the start of the Renaissance. Giotto, who was from Florence, was one of the most essential artists in the early Renaissance. He started to paint naturalistic artworks with volume and perspective, yet also with divine scenes, and he achieved it beautifully. Take this Maestà from 1310 as an example. Compared to the paintings before, it is significantly more spatial. Mary and baby Jesus sitting on a throne are painted in realistic scale, and they seem to be coming forward toward us in the painting. There are two angels in front of them and the crowd behind, different from the ones with seemingly duplicated angels around Mary. Many artworks during the early Renaissance were inspired by a poet named Dante. His Divine Comedy was a book of poems describing the divine world, paradise, hell, and purgatory. Artists became willing to paint the imaginary scenes as well as Dante himself and other characters. The Medici family in Florence played an important role in contributing to the artists. Therefore, they gathered a lot of talented artists, and under their protection, art started booming from the early to the High Renaissance. Before the High Renaissance in the 15th century, Botticelli was a dominant artist, and he was very close to the Medici family. He was well known, and two of his artworks still hang in the Uffizi Art Gallery in Florence, Primavera and The Birth of Venus. Both describe myths about the Roman goddess of love and beauty, Venus, instead of the Virgin Mary. In the Renaissance, artists started to look back to the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations and produce works referring to these archaic cultures. Hence, figures and styles in ancient Greece would pop up frequently in these Renaissance paintings. Primavera, meaning spring, is about Venus in nature with the other gods. Her body is weirdly long, but this unrightly proportioned stature showed her beauty as her body bends slightly, in a posture that is impossible to copy. The background trees behind her were in the shape of an arc, frequently seen in the early Renaissance artworks. The three Graces on the left of Venus are playing merrily, and their hands are in an elegant gesture. The man beside them is Mercury, interested in the fruits on the tree, which might represent the Medici family. On Venus's right side there is Zephyr, the god of west wind, chasing Chloris, the goddess of flowers. Chloris might have turned into the goddess beside her, Flora, the goddess of spring and flowers, holding her dress decorated by blossoms. The characters seem to have no weight and floating upon the land with grass and flowers, which is another characteristic of Botticelli's painting, also found in The Birth of Venus. What is fascinating about the paintings is that they are called tempera paintings, also known as egg tempera, using a mixture of egg yolk and pigment to create paint. It is challenging to preserve them. However, by now they are still complete and colorful. The High Renaissance was approximately from the late 15th century to the early 16th century, and is a peak of artistic revolution and reformation. During the High Renaissance, oil paintings appeared and gradually substituted tempera paintings. Artists began to pay attention to naturalism, shadows, surfaces, and even every muscle. Then a problem emerged. since religion was an important part of every individual's life at that time. The characters and scenes that the works painted were mostly biblical. People believe that symbolism and naturalism cannot be shown simultaneously, since they are antithetical to each other. Biblical characters are sacred, undoubtedly. If naturalism was shown on them, then their holiness would be lost, and divine beings would appear just like mortals. One of the most influential Renaissance artists solved this conflict. He was one of the stars of High Renaissance and a genius who mastered so many fields, even body anatomy. He was Leonardo da Vinci. His painting, The Virgin of the Rocks, showed the Virgin Mary in nature. She is in a graceful posture with the right hand on a child, probably pushing him toward the Christ on the right. This child was John the Baptist with a cross and holds a gesture that seems to be blessing Christ. Virgin Mary's right hand is stretching toward Christ. She is leaning, smiling a little, and looking at John. We find her sacred pureness and lightness, but we also have to admit that naturalism is shown. The archangel on the right is looking back at John. Her tresses, her face, her wings, and her dress are so elegant. In the foreground, there's a body of water, very still and pure. In the background, there's a landscape of rocks, and through the rocks, there is a view of atmospheric perspective. Michelangelo was another versatile artist in the High Renaissance who mastered both sculpture and painting. His version of David stands out from other sculptures' interpretations. The topic is about a young man, David, who defeats his enemy, Goliath. But Michelangelo's sculpture is not the David who has won, which is a prevalent topic in sculptures before. This sculpture captured David's emotion at the time so precisely that his eyes, his muscles, and his body are filled with an impetus, a signal of the fight that makes them strain and firm. He is just about to pull his weapon from his shoulder in order to fight Goliath. However, he also seems a bit uncertain about what to do next, since he was still in his posture of rest, not ready for the second. Michelangelo also achieved masterpieces in painting with frescoes on the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, especially the part on the ceiling, describing biblical stories before Christ was born, Genesis. Figures such as Adam in the center were imposing. He was in a bending posture very slippily, as God was reaching towards his hands, maybe giving him a man's soul. Another highlight is the characters around the main scenes. The Libyan Sibyl sits on one side of the fresco, turning her body slightly back and lifting a book from behind. The muscles on her back were clearly shown, and her arms are powerful. Under her orange and white tresses, her feet touch the ground softly. Just as Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, Raphael finished his works in another room in the Vatican, including the School of Athens. These works, also frescoes, have clear topics and representation: theology, philosophy, poetry, and jurisprudence. Raphael was famed because of them, frequently visited by viewers. A lot of his other paintings are about Virgin Mary, young Christ, and young John the Baptist, which is a very common scene. But Raphael was different, or he exceeds others by his techniques of drawing natural scenes. Take Madonna of the Goldfinch as an example. Virgin Mary pats John lovingly, and she holds a book on her left hand. John is very interested in the finch that Christ caught. Christ leans his head back and shows John the little bird very proudly. He physically resembles a human baby, not a small adult as depicted in earlier artworks, yet the graceful movement of his body reveals his divinity. There is a lovely detail that Christ put his foot on his mother's. The plants and the lake behind are reminding viewers they are out in nature, like going for a picnic on a pleasant afternoon. After the Renaissance ended in the 17th century, Baroque art was next. It was similar to the Hellenistic period in ancient Greece to some extent. Artworks in this period emphasizes characters' emotions, how they move, how they use their strength and poses. Compared to the Renaissance, Baroque art is even more expressive and realistic. Specifically, Renaissance art is idealized, very divine, elegant, and remote. Sometimes characters are in impossible poses. On the other hand, Baroque art is accurate with every character's detail, even making sense that the characters are approaching to the audience, but not idealized. For example, to emphasize the characters and their volume, paintings tended to make the shadow part very dark, forming a contrast for sculptures. With the character's movement, the light forms the shadow in different parts. Another characteristic is that Renaissance art tries to make the smooth contours round. In comparison, Baroque art leaves the shapes in an interrupted but actual state. In the Corrado Chapel of Rome, there is an impressive glittering statue about a woman canonized by an angel, named The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini. The woman is lying on a rock, closing her eyes and opening her mouth like she will say something. At this moment, she is in an ambivalent feeling of both pain and ecstasy. The angel on the other side is smiling sweetly and holding an arrow. Apparently, he's going to plunge it into the woman's body in order to make her divine. The character's attires form deep straights and very dark shadows, probably because the blow of a wind coming from the left. Saint Teresa's clothes seem very thick and heavy, while the angel's dress is so light, forming a contrast between the earth and the heavens. Next, let me introduce French painting from two schools, Rococo and Neoclassical. After Louis XIV died in the early 18th century, Rococo began to overtake Classicism and dominate among artworks. Before Rococo, French paintings nearly paid all attention to the monarchs and their portraits, which now shifted to aristocrats. Aristocrats have a relatively free and exciting life instead of living in a palace all the time. Rococo artworks are easy to recognize since figures in the paintings always wear shining arrays, walk gracefully, and are very luxurious. Another feature of the Rococo style is that the artists emphasize color, not line. At that time, the artists were divided into two major sides, the Rubenists and the Pousinists, followers of two artists with different emphasis in their paintings. Rubenists believe that colors are the most important, but Pousinists claim that lines are essential. Antonin Watteau was a precursor in Rococo art, influential to many later Rococo artists such as Fragonard. One of his paradigmatic artworks is The Pilgrimage to Severa, describing aristocrats in love and heading to the island of Severa, known as where Venus lived. A statue of Venus is on the right with some roses growing on it, alluding to love in the scene. Cupid is dragging a woman's clothes to draw her attention, as another male companion is coaxing her at the same time. As we observe from right to left, the pairs of lovers gradually get closer, and the scene is just like a dancing ball held on a bank. The little angels play with a torch in the sky. Finally, the aristocrats are ready to live here with a boat, and the skyline of Severa appears from far away. Fragonard, influenced by Watteau, painted another painting that was even more Rococo-ish and popular. The Swing, a scene of the aristocrats' luxurious and leisurely life. A young lady is sitting on a swing tied to an enormous leafy tree, pulled by an old man, and her lover is lying on the grass, looking at her excitedly. There are three Cupid statues in this aristocratic garden, representing happiness and love. The young lady in the middle is the highlight. She was sitting on her swing, waving her legs, and her gown was shining pink and embroidered with white lace, so light in the air that it seems to float, matching the small hat on her head. Her enjoyment is not just shown in her facial expression, but also on her feet. She has just kicked off one of her heels, and another one is hanging on her toes. Louise Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, a female artist, was highly regarded in the Royal Academy of Arts. This self-portrait with her daughter Julie could explain why she could succeed despite many barriers for women artists at that time. Forming a triangle in the scene, Lebrun and Julie seems to be together as one. In a pretty blue dress, Julie warmly hugs her mother by putting her arms around her and leaning toward her neck, forming a shadow reasonably on her face. Lebrun, wearing her Greek-style clothes without any fancy decorations, and a red hairband, hugs her child back. Their shining eyes are filled with the love between mother and child. Neoclassicism, which overtook Rococo in the second half of the 18th century, is a totally different style. It opposes the complexity of Rococo paintings and concentrates on characters' outlines, even darkening or removing the background in service of the shapes. Looking at its name, Oath of the Horatii, we could sense an intensity and call upon battles. Painted by Jacques-Louis David, there are four men in the painting, one much older and holding three swords, who is a father. The other three men salute towards the swords. Once, Rome had a battle with another group of men, and each side had to send three men to fight. The Horatii brothers were chosen to defend Rome. The Horatii brothers depicted in this painting have solid muscles and a determined expression for the battle. The swords are the highlight since the father holds them up to the middle of the scene. David could just paint these if he wanted to emphasize the resolution of the soldiers, but there's more. Some women and small children were on the other side, the women and the sisters of the Horatii brothers. In comparison, they seem so weary, so weak and helpless. The brothers' performance would directly affect their future. Because they are women, they have no agency to affect the battle. Therefore, the painting also reflects the state of women in Rome until the 18th century. Next, from France we move to England. I will introduce British art from three periods: Enlightenment, Romanticism, and Pre-Raphaelites. Actually, British art has been evolving greatly since shortly after the Italian Renaissance. The English Renaissance, however, was different. It is about the transition from religious paintings to portraits of kings, queens, and other genteel and wealthy individuals. In the second half of the 17th century, the Enlightenment, a period of renewed philosophy and flourishing science, began. Art was influenced to a large extent. The artists painted their works on every figure so realistically. Some are even describing scenes of people doing science experiments, such as an experiment on a bird in the air pump by Joseph Wright. From the 17th to the 18th century, European countries were passionate about instituting art academies for artists. After France established its academy in 1648, the Royal Academy of Arts, or the RA, was founded in England. Nonetheless, as Romanticism came to England, many artists doubted or even rejected the RA because its skills and styles were restrained, and the Romantics saw it as outdated and dull academic art. Instead, more and more of them leaned toward landscape paintings. They were also against science, the concept which formed during the Enlightenment, that all paintings should be as realistic as possible. This was the second shift of English art, with older generations of artists leading at the front, followed by a newer generation who are even more into the style of Romanticism. Among the new generation of artists, John Constable and J.M.W. Turner were the most salient and distinctive ones. John Constable was crazy about painting landscapes, and including some human figures in the scene to show his topic, human with or versus nature. A lot of his artworks use darker hues to emphasize the intensity of the scene. However, this painting does not show any tension at all. The hay wain, also known as landscape noon, is about common working farmers out in nature. Two horses were pulling their hay wagon across the water, with two local farmers on a cart. On the left is a horse, and an unadorned one, with trees on its side. The broad land can be seen from behind. Constable painted the trees by flicking paint on it, and used overlapping brushstrokes on the water below. The clouds are the must-see of John Constable's paintings. The clouds are painted with volume by adding shadows onto them, so the sky won't be vacant and dull only. There are so many details to notice. The boat in the bushes, the dog on the bank, and even some laborers are on the far side, almost mixed together with nature. It is amazing that even if Constable didn't go to the countryside to gather inspiration, he could still paint the landscape so detailedly according to his memory of living there when he was younger. J.M.W. Turner was also a landscape painting artist, but his style was very different from Constable's. All colors in his painting are entirely blurred, making the scene seem covered by smoke. According to these colors, we must guess that what the image is describing. One of his most famous works, The Snowstorm, shows a snowstorm coming toward a ship, bringing fierce wind to it. The gray color of the snowstorm is everywhere in the scene, swirling and creating billows on the water. Even shadows in the foreground are irregular, bending on the unquiet surface of the water. However, Turner always places a little precise figure in the center, giving the audience a hint of what he was painting. Here we see the formation of a mast in the chaos. The ship is too weak to withstand the wind, the snow, and everything coming toward it. Turner did the same thing as Constable. He conveyed the message of human versus nature. Significantly, Turner supposed tied himself to the mast of a ship during a storm to inspire this painting. Moving on toward the 19th century, Europe is progressively modernized, which brought new features of artwork in that period. Firstly, urban scenes began to appear in the paintings, which means more pedestrians and figures would show up in the scene, instead of a painting describing specific characters. Second of all, technology has advanced, bringing a variety of new transportation and tools to enrich the images. Moreover, the major characters in the paintings shifted again from royal families and aristocrats to middle class and working class, while the audience was generally middle class. Take The Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet as an example of realism. A young man and an old man doing hard work with their shoes on dirt. The Pre-Raphaelites were the most well-known painters after Constable and Turner. They looked back at art before the Raphael and blended the previous topics of painting with modern realism, such as depicting a sister praying beside the lake with lotus. Charles Alston Collins's Convent Thoughts. Another feature to mention, Great Britain has an abundance of literary works, and well-known authors such as William Shakespeare. Artists would add more topics to paint. A paradigmatic one is Sir John Everett's Millais, Ophelia. Ophelia is one of the characters in Shakespeare's play, Hamlet. a young lady who was restricted by her father and died in despair and water. Millais' painting might be the best visualized form of this scene as Ophelia silently drowns into the water, with beautiful nature around her. She sang with her mouth half open, she held some flowers in her hand, and all plants beside her show a sense of innocence. That brings us to the end of this colorful art history journey, and the time with art pieces and their artists. In the progress of studying art history myself, I was amazed by the technique, style, and setting of each piece, which was a fruit of wisdom. When I quickly became aware of the movement and transformation of art in time, I found it even more fascinating. I have to come to understand how art is made and how it was evolved into what it is today. Art history is not just a simple development history of beauty, but about the progress of human thought and development of human civilization and the concept of art beyond the art. It can stimulate individual potential, can open our imagination, and increase the thickness of our thought. This explains the exploration of art history, and the intangible tightly attracted me. Finally, how I long for the global epidemic to end as soon as possible, so that I can step into the museums and historical cities full of art treasures again. I know that art never ends. There's always something new to discover. Thank you.